In the quiet town of Elmswood, the cemetery sat on a lonely hill, shrouded in mist and mystery. It was a place where the townsfolk dared not venture after dusk. Tales of the cemetery were as old as the town itself, stories of ghostly apparitions and strange whispers that seemed to float on the evening breeze. But for Daniel Hawke, these stories were nothing more than superstitious drivel. Daniel, a journalist for the Elmswood Gazette, had always been a skeptic. He prided himself on his logical mind and disdain for anything remotely supernatural. When a series of strange disappearances began to plague Elmswood, he was determined to get to the bottom of it. The local police were baffled, but Daniel suspected there was a more mundane explanation, perhaps a kidnapper or a serial killer. He was convinced that the cemetery, with its eerie reputation, was the perfect place to hide a dark secret. It was a chilly autumn evening when Daniel decided to investigate the cemetery. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and his trusty camera, he climbed the hill and passed through the rusty iron gates. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As he walked among the headstones, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But Daniel pushed the thought aside, attributing it to his overactive imagination. He began by examining the older graves, those that had been there for centuries. The headstones were worn and weathered, inscriptions barely legible. As he moved deeper into the cemetery, the sense of unease grew stronger. His flashlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. He heard a faint whisper, just on the edge of perception. He paused, straining to listen, but the whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started. Determined to find something concrete, Daniel continued his search. He reached a secluded part of the cemetery, where the trees grew denser and the graves more neglected. Here, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. He could almost make out words, but they were jumbled and distorted, like a radio signal just out of tune. Suddenly, his flashlight beam fell on a fresh grave. The soil was freshly turned, the headstone new and unmarked. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He knelt down to examine the grave, but as he did, the whispering rose to a fever pitch. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. Heart pounding, he turned back to the grave and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the light, pale and translucent. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. She opened her mouth, and the whispers became a wail, a sound of unbearable anguish. Daniel stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The light flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fumbled for his flashlight, finally managing to turn it back on. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, now softer, more mournful. He realized he had to leave, but as he turned to go, something caught his eye, a glint of metal among the dirt of the fresh grave. He knelt down and brushed the soil away, revealing a small, ornate locket. Inside was a photograph of a young woman, the same one he had just seen. The back of the locket bore an inscription, "To my dearest Emily, forever in my heart." Daniel pocketed the locket and hurried back to his car, the whispers fading with each step. Back at his apartment, he examined the locket under the harsh light of his desk lamp. There was something about the woman's face that seemed familiar. He spent hours poring over old newspapers and town records, finally uncovering the tragic story of Emily Davenport. Emily had disappeared over 50 years ago, under mysterious circumstances. Her fiancé, Richard, had been inconsolable and had died by suicide shortly after her disappearance. The townsfolk had whispered that her spirit was restless, seeking closure that had never come. Over the next few days, Daniel became obsessed with Emily's story. He visited the town archives, spoke to elderly residents, and pieced together the details of her life. She had been a vibrant, beloved member of the community, engaged to marry Richard Hartman, the son of a wealthy landowner. Her disappearance had shocked the town, and despite extensive searches, no trace of her had ever been found. Daniel felt a strange connection to Emily. He couldn't explain it, but he felt compelled to help her find peace. He returned to the cemetery night after night, hoping to see her again, to communicate with her somehow. But each time, he was met only with the haunting whispers and the oppressive feeling of being watched. One evening, as Daniel was preparing to leave the cemetery, he noticed a figure standing by the old chapel. It was an elderly man, his face hidden in the shadows. The man beckoned him closer, and Daniel hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. The man introduced himself as Samuel, the cemetery's caretaker. He had worked there for decades and knew every inch of the grounds. Samuel was reluctant to talk at first, but Daniel's persistence eventually wore him down. He revealed that Emily's disappearance had been the result of a dark family secret. Richard's father, Harold Hartman, had been a cruel and controlling man. He had discovered that Emily was planning to elope with Richard to escape his tyranny. In a fit of rage, Harold had killed Emily and buried her in an unmarked grave in the cemetery. Samuel had been a young man at the time, working as an apprentice to the caretaker. He had witnessed the murder but had been too afraid to come forward. Over the years, the guilt had eaten away at him. He believed that Emily's spirit was trapped, unable to rest because her body had never been found. Armed with this new information, Daniel knew what he had to do. He convinced Samuel to show him the location of Emily's grave. It was the same fresh grave he had discovered on his first visit. Together, they unearthed the soil, revealing the skeletal remains of a young woman. The locket around her neck confirmed her identity. As they finished their grim task, the air grew colder, and the whispers rose once more. This time, Daniel could understand the words. "Thank you," Emily's voice echoed, filled with gratitude. "I can finally rest." Emily's remains were reburied in a proper grave, with a headstone bearing her name. The townsfolk gathered for a memorial service, honoring the woman who had been lost to them for so long. Daniel felt a sense of peace, knowing he had helped bring closure to Emily's tragic story. But as he stood by her grave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The cemetery still held many secrets, and the whispers of the dead were far from silenced. As he turned to leave, he heard a faint voice call his name, and he knew that Elmswood's haunted past would continue to reveal itself, one whisper at a time. Months passed, and life in Elmswood returned to normal. The cemetery became a place of solace rather than fear, and the tales of ghosts and whispers faded into memory. Daniel continued his work at the Gazette, his investigative prowess sharper than ever. But on quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the trees and the moon cast its silver light over the town, Daniel could still hear the whispers. They were softer now, more like echoes of forgotten sorrows. He knew that the voices from the grave were always there, lingering just out of reach, reminding him of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And so, Elmswood remained a town of secrets, its history woven with threads of mystery and tragedy. And Daniel, forever changed by his encounter with the otherworldly, would always listen for the voices from the grave, ready to uncover the stories that lay hidden beneath the surface of his quiet, haunted town.